Who am I? The Capricorn. Secrets of the Zodiac. By Gypsy Rose Deville. Part 1, Chapter 2. From Riches to Rags Overnight. For my mother, poverty was a major fear because she lived in it her entire life, before marrying my father. Sure, there were a few years of struggle in the beginning of their marriage. But by the time I was 4, we had a live-in nanny. My parents created an amazing lifestyle for us living in Europe, where my mom got to take weekend trips to Holland for wooden shoes or Brussels for handmade lace. My mom had a lucrative job on the base as well, but didn't have to pay any bills, because the military paid for most of it. Nor did she have to be financially savvy, because my dad was the money man who managed all of that, having at least 3 different savings accounts, all with at least 5 figures in each, before he was sent away. Now the time has come for Mama to step into my father's shoes. Her first decision would need to focus on where we were going to move to in the US. I am not going to lie, I was super excited about moving back to the States, seeing as how it had been years. Were we moving to California, New York, Florida? The anticipation was killing me. With her decision solidified, she announced the news that we were moving to. Drumroll. Huntsville, Alabama. Pause for crickets. Yeah, same thing I said. What the hell is a Huntsville? And Alabama? The only thing I knew about Alabama was that they were skinning and hanging black folks there. Was she serious? Of all places, why there? Turns out my Aunt Glenda, TT, and my mother had a plan to move there together, since my TT was also going through a divorce and had just left Germany a couple months before. This did make the blow a little softer, because my TT's youngest daughter, Shonda, is literally one of my favorite people in life. Don't get it twisted, I love her older brother and sister as well, but growing up I rarely saw them, because I was so much younger. Even Shonda is 5 years older than me, and she's the baby. And even though they are not blood relatives, this family is the only one I have known my entire life. Shonda and I lived everywhere from Germany, Alabama, to Georgia together. My TT already set it up for us to move into the apartment, right below hers, once we arrived in Huntsville. And within a couple months, we were flat broke. Even though Mama was familiar with the reality of poverty, for me this was an alien concept. Remind you, by the time I was even conscious of what it meant to go shopping, we were living on a military base, where all were shopping the same stores and living the same lifestyle. I had no idea that name brand was a thing. What is K-Swiss, Adidas, or Reebok? Can I just get some damn tennis shoes, or sneakers, please? We're now shopping at Montgomery Ward, Walmart, before they began selling cute clothes, and Goodwill, all of which ensured at that time that children around the world felt like crap on the first day of school. Hell, buying clothes at Montgomery Ward was always a gamble because you were liable to buy pants with one leg shorter than the other or shirts that may not have an opening for your head. Luckily, I never went along with trends anyway, so I made anything work to my advantage. Always cutting things up and or sewing them together, making my own jewelry, stealing my dad's shirts, and creating my own style. Even if I hated my outfit, I would still walk into the room like I was wearing Gucci or Louis Vuitton. Something that will probably never change about me. Now the food ordeal, for me, especially solidified my new reality. Prior to this point in my life, I was able to eat whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. Eating fresh authentic foods from various cultures every single day, never once questioning if we could afford it. To now, living in a world where coupon clipping became a priority and sales became our best friends. Eating at McDonald's or Long John Silver was a special occasion, and a fancy restaurant was eating at Orion's buffet. I can remember spending the entire day with my mother on Saturdays riding around town, store to store, hoping for the best deals. For example, going to a bakery outlet for all of our baked goods like bread, bagels, and Little Debbie snacks, where they sold at a discount. Same with the farmer's market for the vegetables, meat market for meats and some frozen goods, and any stores that advertised sales in the newspaper. Mama always made it work, stretching her dollars to the max. And even if we only had Spam or potted meat left to eat, my mama made the best Spam sandwiches in the South. She could literally make a meal out of anything, and to this day, my mama is still one of the best cooks in the world to me. I've always loved watching her cook, and when I was really little, she would sit me on the counter as she did so. The older I got, the more I'd help, and by the time I was 9, I could cook entire meals by myself. Mama also loved a good yard sale, and you could always find one in Huntsville on a Saturday as long as the weather was nice. So, if we would see one while riding around, she would always pull over and take a walk through, for a chance at finding any steals. It reminded me of those days in Germany when we would walk for miles during junking, gathering some of the most amazing items that I still can't imagine someone just giving away. I must admit these were some of my fondest memories when thinking of time spent with my mother. Being one of those things that I felt was ours, allowing me to feel connected to her, and I desperately needed those moments. Realizing that, without them, our relationship would have never had a chance even to this day. Because they gave hope that as much as I felt she hated me as a person, she still loved me as her child. This would be around the time that I began to admire her for the strength that I knew it took her to even get through each day. I felt obligated to help her in any way that I could, in my attempt to make things easier for her, because I was beginning to regret some of the ways that I'd previously judged her due to my own childish naive ignorance. As her eldest, 9 years old at this point, it was now my duty to step up and make sure my little brother was taken care of, as well as hold the house down. I wanted to help carry some of the burdens she was left with, due to my dad's departure. I honestly do not remember anyone ever speaking to me about doing this, or even explaining to me how I was supposed to do the things I just naturally began doing. However, I never felt as though this was even noticed or ever appreciated, and it felt as though the more I did, the more that was just expected of me. And again, nothing I did was ever good enough. At some point I just became the Cinderella of the house, without the fairy tale. I desperately longed for her approval in those days, but just felt more rejection instead. Eventually, this rejection I felt would lead to the development of my, who the hell am I trying to please, mentality, much of which I still carry today. It would still be almost 2 decades before I truly understood that she never hated me, but rather loved me so much that she just wanted the best for me. As a perfectionist, aka OCD, it definitely came across as constant criticism. You would have had to have been there to truly understand the extremes that she would take. In fact, when I was younger living in Germany, she'd literally wake us up at the crack of dawn to clean the house, and by the time the sun was coming down, she would be furious with all of us because it was still not up to her standards. Running through the house yelling and screaming at the top of her lungs, slamming doors and cabinets, to emphasize her disdain with each of us and our filthiness. When she'd begin these tyrant tantrums, my father and I would hide in the closet and just count down to the next door slams, which seemed to tickle us to death after a while. But, fast forward, I'm now on my own with her, because my father was locked up. Alone. Looking the most like, and acting the most like, the man who left her jaded in the first place. The number one absolutely most ultimate reality check for me would definitely have to be the culture shock I experienced immediately after moving to Alabama. In Germany, I never felt any type of racism in any way, shape, or form. One of the many other advantages of living on a multicultural military base, where my first best friends were 2 black girls, a German girl, a Filipino, and a Korean. In fact, never truly understanding racism existed, until I was in 4th grade when a week-long marathon special of Alex Haley's Roots and Queen came on television. It's crazy, because immediately after watching those series, I thought I heard a couple of German kids say nigger while I was outside riding my bike. I did what only made sense in my eyes to teach them a lesson, gathering a pocket full of the smooth stones that lined our apartments and doing a drive-by on my bicycle. This resulted with me busting one of them in the head, apparently. Arriving home later that evening to find the MPs standing outside my apartment building with my parents, the parents of the victim, and the poor victimized kid with this huge bandage wrapped around his head. Turns out they weren't even calling me anything. Neger in German means black. Hearing this word most of my life at this point, not in any negative way, but obviously those movies messed me up a little. It really goes to show how the mind works and how easily it can be programmed. But even after that, I was never able to see color or class as a defining factor for any individual. Now I know you're probably wondering, how is it possible I never knew of racism, being raised in Germany? What about the Holocaust, right? So I think here is where we have to break down manipulation of the mind when passing down history. Of course we were taught about the Holocaust, and I think I've always respected the fact that Germany acknowledged it in an apologetic way while emphasizing what should not ever be done again. It was a narrative taught as an isolated incident, rather than an ongoing mentality. This was further backed up by the fact that they had such an embracing nature my entire time there. Now to be fair, this may have something to do with the false and stolen history Germany is guilty of still harboring and perpetuating to this day. I digress, but at least the effort is there. One of my favorite stories growing up was The Diary of Anne Frank, and I actually visited a resort in the mountains of Berchtesgaden, which was once an old Nazi camp. So of course I knew what the concept of racism was. However, the systematic racism actually experienced in America, on the black versus white scale, had a far more devastating effect on me. Fuel to that fire for most black people in America is that after having racism shoved down your throat in school, one wakes up to a world that goes out of its way to show you that nothing is going to change on your behalf, going so far as to create oppressive agendas against you in hopes of your demise. One more thing before we move forward. You also have to understand where I fall on the color scale myself, to really see where I'm coming from regarding race. I am not just black, I am blackety black. I've always been one of the darkest spots in any room, even amongst black people. To make things worse, even in my own family, I'm the darkest besides my father. But I have a daddy who always told me I'm beautiful and loved, which overpowered any outside influences. Unfortunately, that only held weight until I began experiencing losing all of the boys that I'd crush on, to all of my light-skinned friends. It was one of those things that became painfully obvious by middle and high school, and this was also when I began to notice this influence exaggerated on a grander scale through movies and television. I didn't understand how others couldn't see what I would when I'd look in the mirror and feel beautiful. One of those things I battled with constantly when I was young. But even with this inner turmoil of identity, I still did not see color as everyone else did. When we first moved to Huntsville, we moved to the south side, and I began the 5th grade at Whitesburg Elementary School, where I was one of 5 black kids in the entire 5th grade. In the middle of that same year, we moved to the north side of Huntsville, and I transferred to Rolling Hills Elementary School, where there were 5 white kids in the entire school. Talk about culture shock, being in complete disbelief that this was not only a real thing outside of movies about the civil rights movement, but that this could even still exist. We actually remained on the north side for our duration in Huntsville, bouncing from house to house over the next few years. The color lines in Huntsville were so brutally clear, and you could clearly see the difference in each area from the condition of the roads, the schools, and especially the neighborhoods. Now I'm being introduced to the hood life, and I had no clue hoods existed. I was beyond confused as to what I was experiencing, and cognitive dissonance was inevitable. Some of the neighborhoods we lived in while in Huntsville were better than others, but I will be the first to admit that going through excessive drama in life while living in the hood hits so much different than the drama life in the suburbs. The energy alone is different, heavy with oppression. New experiences were being introduced now, like coming home from school to our electricity being cut off, because we couldn't pay the light bill, living by candlelight and boiling water on the stove to take baths. Having to hand wash our clothes in the bathtub and hanging them around the house to dry. Honestly, none of that really bothered me though. My crazy imagination would always turn these things into something adventurous, like pretending that we were living in a wood cabin that sat in the middle of nowhere, so of course there was no electricity. I started doing things like this to not only distract myself but to also distract and entertain my baby brothers, whether it was from my parents' many battles or the fact that we were living in a hotel. See, what you have to understand about me is no matter what I've been through, no matter how traumatizing, I somehow always figured out how to have fun in every situation. Even during the worst of times expressed in this manuscript, and even more not mentioned, know that I would create moments of escape through imagination, laughter, and music. This will probably now explain to my children all of those random tickle attacks and spontaneous 10-minute dance parties for no reason at all, that were never explained. Do not mistake me, because it was not all bad in Huntsville. In fact, it will always be one of my homes, holding a special place in my heart, along with Stuttgart and Atlanta. And although we moved around a lot, we never left the north side. So, I was blessed to have made some of the best lifelong friends there and had plenty of epic adventures with them all. This was the first time, in my life, that I was able to remain with the same group of people for more than a couple months at a time. Spending the next 6 years of my life there until I left for Atlanta in the middle of high school. And my father got out, after a couple of years at Fort Huachuca, Arizona Penitentiary, and joined us in Huntsville. I can only imagine how hard it had to have been for him to readjust to life with a felony, especially once he realized the money was all gone. Daddy's comeback taught me so much about the true definition of a hustler after watching how he maneuvered and always figured out how to make a dollar. I witnessed him work in dangerous warehouses, sell products and jewelry, start a cleaning service that contracted with the military base to clean the quarters after people would move out, to even having a booth at a local flea market. His motto was, "A hard head could always make it," one I would carry with me forever. Mainly because I thought he was talking about me when he said this, because he always told me that I was hard-headed. Always joking that I was nothing but hard head and bubblegum. Don't ask, lol. Most impressive was my father's sobriety, no longer drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes, quitting cold turkey. It was a blessing and a curse when he came home though, because I could not have been happier to see him, but it did not take long for my parents to turn our home back into a war zone. This time they started a series of makeup and breakup cycles that drove me insane. It looked a little something like this. We would settle in as a family again. Tension would begin to build, and arguments would erupt to the point of complete discomfort and annoyance for all. Daddy would leave the house, sometimes on his own, sometimes getting kicked out by Mama. Things would settle down for a second. Then he would come back. And the cycle continued. My resentment prevailed due to her continuously allowing him to come back home, only to take the brunt of all her frustrations out on me, when he'd only fuck up again. Oh, and it was during one of these separations that my middle brother and I got the call to the dining room table to have a family discussion. Starting this conversation by asking, "Well, remember when you used to say you wanted another brother or sister?" Of course I used to say that. When I was 5. At this point I'm 14. The weight and responsibilities that were placed upon me by this point were already too overwhelming. Burdens I began carrying way too young only continued to magnify tremendously, even with my father back. Don't forget that this was still an era where I believed my mother hated me, and by the time my baby brother was born, I barely even saw my father. I'll always respect the fact that Daddy always took care of home by any means necessary, but it never overcompensated his absence. Resenting both of them for their dramas, and the things they were putting me and my brothers through, was beginning to manifest through sneaky teen rebellious behavior such as kleptomania, but majority showing in my attitude. This is where being eclectic in my interests began to prove its value in my life. Being forced to be at school anyway, I began using it as a way to channel my energy, indulging in all sorts of extracurricular activities, any damn excuse to remain away from my house. Never being one who likes to be categorized or judged, allows me to generally get along with most people, because I go out of my way to give everyone the same chances I covet. Another aspect of me that will never change. Credit this trait to living a life of constantly having to adapt into new settings, high school being no different. However, I never tried to fit in, or felt pressed for anyone's friendship, and most importantly, no one, and I mean no one, has ever had the authority to tell me who I could or couldn't be friends with. And I don't give a shit about titles or status, only a person's spirit or energy. So in school, you could have been considered the cool kid, but if your attitude was nasty as hell, I was nowhere near impressed. Just as well as if you were considered a nerd. As long as the person was authentic and didn't ride my nerves, they were good in my book. Not sure if I was ever categorized because I never hung with just one group, being that I was a jack of all trades who was into everything. I was on the cheerleading team. Editor of the school's newspaper by 10th grade. President of the German club. Member of the academic team. Math team. JTV crew, which was our high school's television station. Every choir. And even pledged to be a sweetheart in one of our high school's fraternities, Kappa Phi Kappa Suite, just to name a few of my activities. A few friends and I even started a dance crew called Protégé, and we were pretty damn good too, winning several competitions in the city. Things like this not only kept me away from the house but fulfilled the needs of my self-diagnosed multiple personalities, while also keeping me out of trouble. A pattern I wouldn't understand until later, that often saved me from myself throughout my life. There's also this one group that holds a special place in my heart even to this day, the JOJ Marching Jags Band crew. This collective of talented, insane musical geniuses gave me joy anytime I entered the band room. Some of us were closer than others, of course, but we were all family. This was the best high school band in Huntsville with the absolute best band teacher in the nation. This band was the entire reason I ever picked up a clarinet in the first place, and it was such an honor to be a part of it. We all took pride in claiming our place next to our fellow musicians, because it took a lot of effort to be able to do so. In fact, we not only had to audition to join, but also pledge into our sections, as if you were joining a fraternity or sorority. CNETs for life. You don't even want to know what would happen to anyone who tried to disrespect us. The entire band was always ready. And even though I did not get to march during football season as much as I would have liked, I would still spend the entire summer training with them just to have somewhere to go. You can say that my friends played a major role in rescuing me from my daily hell. By 9th grade I craved a good sleepover for the escape and would often split my weekends between my 3 best friends, Rosie, Tessa, Tasha, and my favorite cousin Shonda. Squeezing in some weekends for some of my other close friends who all gave me solace during chaos, and to this day I do not believe they knew how much I needed them and depended on them. Rosie is the very first I was blessed to call my bestie in Alabama and will always and forever be one of the most amazing people I have ever been blessed to meet in my life. Rewinding back to elementary, in 5th grade, remember that I did not arrive at Rolling Hills until the middle of the school year. So even though I got to know a few people, I can't say I formed any real friendships before that summer. Rosie's classroom was next to mine, but we only interacted a couple of times that I can remember, nothing I believed to be significant though. The following year we began our middle school journey at Davis Hills. As summer came to end, I remember thinking, would anyone remember me since they only had a hot second to meet me before the 3-month hiatus. On the first day of school 6th grade I was sitting on the benches in front of the school after just getting dropped off. I was trying to get my life together before entering the building, when all of a sudden, a girl sat down next to me and just began talking to me as if we had been having a conversation the whole time. It took me a second to recognize who this girl was, but it was none other than Rosie, who'd lost a ton of weight over the summer and looked fantastic. And just like water our conversation flowed, and we clicked in a way that was not normal for me because I do not connect to people easily even if they connect to me. Rosie was different though, and we were immediately inseparable. She inspired me because she was like pure light to my darkness and would infect anyone she came into contact with joy, and I wanted to be more like that. And thanks to Rosie, I knew half of the school by the end of that week. Having everything in common from our taste in music, boys, and love for dancing. Rosie is the first person outside of my cousin that I grew that close to. Her family became mine as well, even though me and half the girls at the school had a crush on her middle brother who was a couple grades above us. Another thing we have in common, each having 3 brothers. We both also have grandmothers named Rose, which is whom she was named after. I've always been obsessed with her mother, and often wished she was mine, those times when I was younger and not getting along with my own. She's the complete opposite of my mother, and I deemed her the cool mom. Rosie and I even tried to set her mom up with my dad when my parents separated so we could officially become sisters. We were so close too, but I am sure my dad messed that up somehow. LOL. I spent most of my 6th to 8th grade years bouncing between the houses of Rosie's moms and grandmas. We made up dances and cheer routines that we would do at football games and school dances, and even had our own style that included oversized silk pajama tops and lots of tennis skirts, with a pair of biker shorts underneath in case we needed to bust a split for no reason at all. Rosie was also the ultimate athlete, loving athletics as much as I loved entertainment. She played basketball, volleyball, and even ran track. I would even join some of these teams with her, just because she always insisted, but I was terrible whereas she was always a star. Rosie's always been there for me, and I cannot remember ever having a real fight with her. In fact, I don't remember her even having many enemies, other than those girls who may have liked the same boys she did. Everything was an adventure when we were together, and I felt better about myself just being friends with her. And if anyone mentioned we favored, I felt prettier because I thought she was beautiful. For her 16th birthday I threw her a party at my house in which the entire high school seemed to show up to, even though it originated as a small get-together with a couple friends. It was epic for a party in the backyard with nothing but a boom box and a speaker. I am still flabbergasted about the fact that my mama did not have a total cow. Rosie and I were also always dating best friends, cousins, or brothers, and would sneak out the house to have secret double-date rendezvous. I also appreciated her for allowing me to borrow her grandma because she knew how that was a sore spot for me. By 10th grade my parents had finally separated for good, and my brothers and I was supposed to spend every other weekend with my dad. I stopped going though, because, as always, going with my dad meant going with him and whichever one of his many women at the time. So mama would just send my 2 little brothers instead. This one particular weekend would change me drastically, and just so happened to be one of those weekends my brothers were with my father. Many details of the day are fuzzy, but I remember riding home with my mom when I began having the worst stomach cramps of my life. When we reached the house, I headed straight to the bathroom. I heard the phone ring but was stuck on the toilet, so my mama answered it. Next thing I knew, she was banging on the bathroom door saying hurry up because we needed to go to the hospital. My brother had been hit by a car. My middle brother. I remember thinking that I must have heard her wrong because she did not sound panicked, but I still hurried. Rushing to the hospital, we found my dad, his fiancée, at the time, and her family standing by the ER. It was when I saw their faces that I began feeling an overwhelming sinking in my gut. As Mama went to get the details from the adults, I sat with my stepbrother and his best friend who began to tell me what actually happened. Apparently, my dad and his fiancée were inside the house and all the boys went outside to play on their bikes. My brother had fallen off his bike into the street, and as he attempted to get up, he was blindsided by a speeding drunk driver. As they continued the story, I could see my mother on the other side of the room breaking down as she got the rundown of his condition. He died twice in the ambulance, had 3 blood clots on his brain, and was currently in a coma. He'd also suffered a broken arm and leg on his right side. Things are really blurry after this, but all I remember is screaming for my baby brother, and demanding he be brought to me. Without hesitation they obliged, and once I grabbed him, I then demanded to be taken home. I did not trust anyone else with him at this point and just wanted to go home. I don't even remember who took us, but Mama stayed at the hospital and when my brother and I got home, I laid him in my bed and held on to him the rest of the night. The next morning my mama woke me up while trying to grab my brother out of my bed. She asked me how I was feeling, and I just asked to go to school because I had to keep my mind busy. She asked was I sure and I confirmed. When I got to school, I went straight to the band room to catch up with my friends. Huntsville was small enough that word would always spread fast. One of my homegirls approached me with a huge smile on her face and giggled. I heard about your brother, tell me what happened, and don't make me laugh, in a joking manner. Apparently, she thought it was far less serious than it actually was. However, I did not take even a second to process it that way and immediately blacked out. Not sure what all I did, but when I came to, several of my friends were pushing me into the instrument closet to keep me from putting my hands on her. It was clear I did not need to be at school. My mom came back to pick me up and I remember saying I wanted my cousin, Shonda, and the next thing I knew my cousin pulled up to the house shortly after I arrived. I got in the car and left with her without speaking a word, not even caring where we were going. She was smoking a cigarette as she usually did, but this time I snatched it from her and began smoking it myself. This was the first time I'd ever smoked one, but you would think I'd been smoking for years the way I was pulling on it. My mind was in a cloud of confusion, anger, and fear. No one knew if my brother would live or die, and I'd never lost anyone close to me before. My brothers have always meant the world to me, and I never fathomed a day that one of them would no longer be here. You could say this was when I went completely left. I was beyond over the whole good girl thing, which I wasn't great at anyways. Even more so, tired of the constant turmoil, pain, and unfairness of my life. Angry with the world, my parents, God, and any and everything that ever played any role in my misery. I wanted to escape, and I had no doubts that I would achieve that through allowing my innate alter ego to be its natural rotten self. Of course, I'd always been told I was bad anyway, but what no one understood was that, prior to, I was actually trying my best to be their version of good, no matter how uncomfortable I felt. To make it worse, at that time I felt I couldn't even please my own mother. So who the hell was I trying to impress? I began every self-destructive behavior possible, from smoking weed and cigarettes, drinking, having sex off the chain, going so far as to dealing with a 24-year-old at 15, skipping school, and even participating in various illegal activities just because I wanted to. And the more I was learning about how to hustle in the streets, the more self-sufficient I became. Mastering being bad because I've always had a far more innocent look than half of the shit I was actually into. Smart enough to give my mama what she needed to stay off my case, like good grades and portfolio of activities, but sneaking out of my window to steal her car just to see my crush at the time, Shade Tree, and this was before I even had a license. I was becoming reckless and really developing a self-destructive mindset, which only became easier to get away with, because my parents became particularly distracted with my middle brother's condition. My brother came out of his coma a few days after the accident, but due to the traumatic brain injury, was now deemed totally mentally disabled. Unable to use the right side of his body or even say his own name. I remember visiting the hospital, soon as I was informed that he'd awaken. Being warned before entering the room for what I was about to see, and not knowing that nothing could have really prepared me. It took everything I had within me to not immediately break down when I finally seen his broken state. But before I even had a chance, he looked up, realizing that it was me in the room, and instantly lit up with the most illuminating smile. They said it was the first time that he smiled since waking up. But he could not talk to me, and as much as I wanted to hug him, with all the tubes and bandages, I was in fear of harming him more. So, I instead, simply expressed how much I loved him while squeezing his hand, as my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Not sure if I even successfully pulled off the brave face I was trying to portray, because on the inside I was crying like a baby and screaming in agony, and I instantly fell apart as soon as I was out of his view. Within a week after coming out of his coma, my brother was transferred to Atlanta, where they have the Scottish Rite Center and the Ronald McDonald House, both of which specialized in helping with my brother's condition. My father shut everything down immediately, without hesitation, and went with my brother to Atlanta, where they remained for several months while his team of doctors performed additional surgeries, as well as strategized his recovery and physical therapies. Doctors went from originally saying that my brother would never come out of his coma, to then warning that he would never walk or talk or function as a normal person ever again, to further suggesting he would be mentally retarded for the rest of his life. Each odd he'd beat. My daddy said that one day, after months of procedures and therapies, my brother woke up and just snapped out of it, asking for a banana. He's a miracle that no one has been able to explain to this day. Even though he still had a long way to go in his recovery, my brother was back. But now, whenever they came home to Huntsville for visits, my brother was stuck in a wheelchair, with a cast on both his right leg and arm, which was also accompanied by this obnoxious metal contraption that looked most uncomfortable. So, although he'd try his best to remain in good spirits, there were often times that he was extremely angry as well. I assume this is because he was resentful of his condition, not being able to enjoy life as a normal 11-year-old little boy anymore. I can't even begin to imagine what all he may have had going on in his head, but it was obviously a nightmare for him, and I hated being so helpless in the situation. My best friend Tasha and I were inseparable at this point. Either she was at my house, or I was at hers, because my mama was always taking trips to Atlanta. I practically lived with her family in 10th grade. Our relationship is crazy because we were enemies at first, never having any real issues, except that in middle school she was best friends with a chick I absolutely could not stand whom she'd constantly defend. However, one night at a Christmas concert we were performing in with the band, our mothers met and decided to become carpool buddies. This was one of their biggest mistakes too. Because we became a tag team duo that neither of our mothers were prepared for. Soulmates, bonding over our mother issues, band, and boys, with matching unapologetic personalities. She is my sister from another mister and my best friend even today, because she's one of the few people who understands me wholeheartedly, One afternoon, Tasha and her mother came over to the apartment, apparently per my mother's request. Our mothers proceeded to ask if they could speak with the both of us in the living room, which was unusual, but we didn't think much of it. My mother thought it best to use this as the opportunity to announce that we were moving again. This time to Atlanta. This would have been amazing news 6 years ago, but at this point I was in the middle of high school where I knew everybody and loved my school. Tasha and I sat in silence for a few seconds, then looked each other in the eyes, before erupting into the most disrespectful laughter and walking away, as if we were not even trying to entertain the conversation. I was beyond pissed, trying to come up with any alternatives possible, including moving in with Tasha and her family officially, but my mama was not hearing any of it. It wasn't more than a couple weeks later, I came home from school, immediately hearing a knock at the door after arriving. Apparently, the rent hadn't been paid, and the sheriffs were there to evict us. Home alone, I called my mother, panicking, as I helplessly watched these assholes place all of our belongings outside on the curb. But this feeling was all too familiar because I had been here before. That gut-wrenching realization of knowing that this was it, the end. It was as if them throwing our belongings out of our home onto the side of the street confirmed our time in Huntsville was up. I finally found a place to call home, a place that I finally laid some roots. Never getting so close to so many people like that before because military life did not allow you to. Never even wanting to move to this fucking place to begin with. And now that I love it, I have to leave. Needless to say, my heart was beyond broken.